I'm sure everybody knows myself. I'm leading product management for the operations bridge session, and Alexei asked me to go through essentially a product management update with regards to COSO. So a couple of slides we put together, the standard slide deck, everything that has a blue rectangle in the top right corner is directions, and thus talking about futures. Here's the agenda that we put together for the next 2 hours, which is essentially going in general a little bit over the announcement, what was done, the status of reporting the analytics on the Optic Data Lake that we are offering, the customer adoption, where we are with COSO in customer's hand, and the general future outlook when it comes to cloud monitoring. Okay, let's get into the Optic Data Lake or the Optic branding. Optic is essentially a new branding of the item platform. As the portfolio moves largely to a bring your own Kubernetes solution, with the May release, we will have the entire item portfolio and bring your own Kubernetes. We now start to be able to run in the same cluster, just with different in the different namespaces, but essentially in the same cluster. So that is actually the driver for calling it the operations platform for transformation intelligence and cloud, which essentially is the long name from an Optic perspective. When we're looking into the assets of Optic, it's very similar to the item platform that you might have seen before. It's now what used to be operations orchestration, or the orchestration engine is Optic orchestration engine, and thus the COSO data lake is actually Optic data lake. So everything that is the core shared components that multiple solutions in the item portfolio are using is all branded Optic. And the Optic core services are essentially the core services from the CDF perspective. The suites on top more or less remain the same. Service monitoring and remediation is the operations bridge suite, and on top of it are general functions that a lot of suites share the same. And you see, as we're going more and more into the direction of the Optic data lake, you see more and more on how the elements are coming together of every suite is producing something that the other suite essentially can take advantage of down the road. From a use case perspective, you obviously have BVD that already is everybody using. From a reporting perspective, REST APIs and BVD can also be used from a mobile interface perspective. So for us, that's the picture that you have seen before. It actually remains the same, where we basically publish our schema, where we provide and bring your own BI solutions on top, where we have the service assurance portfolio already directly writing data into the Optic data lake, network data, system data, NA or SA data in terms of automation, and BPM and RAM from an application data, as well as third parties through the third party data ingestion via the agent coming into the Optic data lake. And then you have capabilities on top and shared components overlaid primarily today, reporting and BVD as a shared component, but the networking team is working on performance troubleshooter, which will be a shared component that everybody's using, but we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. And then we have the event management through event analytics. Okay, looking into the latest releases, and then I pause for the first questions. We had the 2020-10 IP1 for Classic or IP2 for CDF. There were a couple of items that were interesting from an Optic data lake perspective. Starting on the left in the gray color is actually the improvement in scale. And there, very importantly, when we talk about scale, some people misread our scale documentation. When we say we have tested in the 2020-10, we have tested 5,000 agents, then it have in addition tested 5,000 nodes. We have in addition 7,500 site scope monitors plus 500 agent streaming, which means in total we have 18,000 elements firing data into Optic Data Lake. That is why you see later on in the adoption, we have very well a customer that has more than 10,000 systems connected into COSO as it is today, because that is in that boundary. Now, that cumulative number that I was just calculating for you, basically we improved with a 3x scale in the IP2 release, and we'll continue doing that. As the scale on the operations bridge side behaves very fairly linear, we basically stop on that validation and just update the calculator for the May release to scale to 60, 70, 80,000 agents as you wish. What the networking team is doing, the networking team continues on the validation and validates a couple of larger number of nodes, specifically because the data ingestion from NetFlow data looks slightly different than a key value pair of an agent that we are collecting, as an example. The other piece that we have released, as I mentioned, third-party metrics, is essentially custom metric ingestion through a toolkit that we released, and that custom metric ingestion goes through the agent metric store. And sorry, 1 second. And with that, we basically have the size limitation of the agent metric store itself that demands a little bit or drives a little bit the amount of metrics that we can pipe through. Now, what does it really mean? Think about it. If you had a data warehouse that you would like to ingest into Optic Data Lake, and you had one data warehouse of metrics on the third-party application side, potentially. You have a high-performing data warehouse on the other side, but you pipe everything through a straw, which is essentially the agent metric store. The agent metric store is an embedded database with SQL data or MySQL or something that we are leveraging there. So what we are still working on is a general data pipe that allows you to ingest larger data volumes into the Optic Data Lake. So look at the current custom metric ingestion for metric ingestion with limited in terms of throughput. Now, what did we else do? In addition, we updated on the left side, the content. We released the integration hub in December, January, with the initial 5 to 6 integrations, and we updated it with 8 new additional platforms that we are supporting. Nutanix, Jira, Cherwell, BMC. Somebody moved off. Okay, better. And then we have the additional items that happened on OBM, where we basically, from a COSO perspective, improved the algorithm on how AEC and the OBM existing correlations work together. That was some of the early findings where we realized some of the correlations conflicting with each other as people were using it. That got improved with the IP. And then we have the additional items from an HTML5 UI. Let me pause there and see whether there are any questions. If anybody, somebody went off mute anyway a second ago. So you can also type the questions if you wish in the chat. I will be at these slides typically stopping for questions. Okay, if there are no questions, then let me continue. So where are we from a reporting perspective, and where are we taking the portfolio? So a little bit a look into the past on what we have today from an operations bridge reporter perspective. So we had the operations bridge reporter as a common tool across NA, NMI, server automation. It was bundled and it basically replaced the originally built server automation reporting tool, OMI. All of that was actually a centralized reporting that we basically provided 300 plus reports out of the box. What we found was that a lot of these out-of-the-box reports were not used. Only a selected subset was actually used. So that's also what we're planning to do moving forward, that we're basically focusing on the reports that are heavily used by the customers from our knowledge, and not the entire OBR reports when it comes to optic-based reporting. The other thing that we noticed when we worked with the solution set, that there was a large community of the customers who just were looking for very simple reporting, dashboarding of some of the metrics, that were overwhelmed with the business object complexity that we enforced through the technology set that we had in OBR. That was basically the driving factor for us to move towards BVD reporting. And that's why initially, primarily for executive updates, we introduced the business value dashboard, where the business value dashboard is primarily a visualization tool that allows you to do graphical dashboards like you see on the screen, not so much technical reports that you quickly want to stitch together. So here, really, the idea of BVD in the initial form when we released it was really focused on graphical, attractive dashboards for stakeholders and non-IT personnel, with directly streaming data from our data set as well as third-party data set. What we then have developed out of that is the optic reporting, where we basically took BVD and slowly developed it further by basically putting it on top of the optic data lake. You immediately, we can release dashboards, and you immediately can display those dashboards in the BVD. In the original form, it basically was a clean sheet of paper, and you would have to stitch all the data connections, data pipes into the dashboard as it is. Also, you had no way of interacting with the data in its original form. If you want to see last week's data, it was not possible, so that was added. And if you wanted to have maybe a different node that you wanted to look into from a report perspective, you couldn't really interact with the dashboard as it is. So those elements were added. But BVD, very carefully, is not a BI tool, and we're not intended to be a BI tool. If we wanted to have another BI tool, we would have replaced BO with another tooling. So that's why we're also supporting bring your own BI, so that we give the flexibility to the customer what he wants today to do. When we started OBR many years back, BO was actually quite often used for the customers that wanted to do heavy lifting BI functionality. Nowadays, it's Power BI, Tableau, etc. are the tools of choice. 5-6 years from now might be a new one, and that's why we're clearly documenting the schema so that you basically can connect your tool of choice from a BI tooling perspective. We still are looking carefully at the discussion on the BI of things that are still missing from a capability perspective and reporting perspective, because you can't schedule a PDF generation with BVD as it is today. So those are the elements that we are right now looking into, and what needs to be further enhanced. But we do not intend to create a full-blown BI tool out of BVD. Okay, looking into the reporting, it's a cross-domain reporting, as you know, and the style and look and feel is kept consistent across automation, network, and operations bridge portfolio. So DCA, NOM, and Ops bridge. We have created a couple of cross-domain reports, where on this one you see system, network, and application performance all together into, as well as availability, all together into a single report. And you nicely have the other screens there on how to select a time or how to select a parameter. Now, this functionality is getting into the BVD screen by this little arrow here on the right. For those of you who haven't used it, that actually fades in those elements to let you select this. The parameter is something that you can, if you create your own BVDs on top of the SQL database, can actually drive yourself by setting the right attributes in that SQL query to allow which of the data points that you see on the BVD should actually parameters that the user should interact with. Now let's look at a couple of examples. There's another report that we created from a cross-domain report where we basically combine system data, performance data together with vulnerability data. Sometimes vulnerability and system performance relate to each other because somebody is exploiting that vulnerability, which leads to higher CPU memory load onto a system, and having an overlay report is actually helping you in order understanding that. That's why we created that combination of report. There's also the BPM dashboards. You might remember initially on the reports we had this world map that we use. This now is more an out-of-the-box dashboard on all of the data that we are collecting from a BPM perspective, with an overview dashboard and then a drill down dashboard to get into more data points as we speak. NOM has the same, and you can see, and that's why I'm just going quickly through those reports, because I don't want to spend time in clearly understanding those different reports, more to give you a feeling, okay, what type of reports are there. It's the same concept, the same look and feel, the same that you navigate from a summary report to a detailed report, and then you have essentially the information at your hand. And that uniformity from a usability perspective actually is one of the key elements also from optics, so that if you know and understand one tool, you should be understanding the other tools, how to use them, and how to maneuver through navigate through the tooling. Okay, here you have a DCA patch summary report, less graphic, more table-centric. And with that, I stop the examples of the different report examples. Any questions before we dive into the next topic? Does COSO report has concepts like OPR in which data needs to be rolled up for daily, weekly, monthly, and then yearly? So we do not aggregate the data in Optic Data Lake. That is on purpose, because if we would aggregate them, we could not do the analytical functions on top of them. Vertica would do the aggregation on the data read. So if you need to do an aggregation of the reports, you would do that directly in the SQL statement. So you don't need to, like OBR was actually aggregating the data before it's writing the data into the database. And yes, you can create them. I don't know top of my mind whether we have created those aggregation of data in the out-of-the-box reports ourselves. I would need to look. Is it still mandatory to design a dashboard using Visio, or do we have flexibility to design dashboard from GUI console? So Dinesh, yes, the design is still the same. It's still Visio. We provide those dashboards as Visios on the marketplace, I think, so that you actually can easily change and adjust them. But Visio is still the tool of choice. So the underlying BVD is still the same as the very original one, though the dashboards that you see there now are a lot more technical and standard. In order to navigate through the data, we have other tooling like the performance troubleshooter that we are looking into. What if customer doesn't have the BI tool and need custom reporting? Okay, so BVD for us is a reporting solution. As I said, we are adding in very a few items like the scheduling to PDF to complement the solution, and then the custom reports would have to be generated in Visio by taking the sample that we provide and creating your own reports out of it. Do we have capability to automate report scheduling too? So what I keep saying about that's something that we will do. Still lie in the roadmap of something that we need to look into from a scheduling perspective. Okay, let's take a look and move forward on bringing your own Kubernetes. So what we have introduced in 2010, we have introduced samples from a Grafana perspective. So now we have documented clearly Power BI, Tableau, and Grafana. But the general message I want you to take away was we document the schema just because we pick sample tools which are very dominant in the market, like Power BI, Tableau, and Grafana, doesn't mean that others like ClickView, ClickSense, or Looker are not supported. We're essentially supporting the API and the schema, which basically means a customer can connect any other tooling that he wish to the Optic Data Lake. I posted the pages where you can actually find the Bring Your Own BI white paper or the schema. The schema with every release, as we're updating it, will be updated and changed. Okay, let's go into OPSBridge reporting direction. Where are we going? What is our plan? So 10.5 from an OBR perspective is planned to be our last release of OBR. And we do not intend to have another version of it. That gives OBR a certain support life. That means customers should start making themselves familiar with Optic Data Lake and Optic reporting. We highly suggest to get Optic with the Kubernetes stacks into the lab, at least from a customer today. And then think about how can we move the reporting, or what are the reporting gaps in order to move the customer over. Now, then when we introduce Optic Data Lake, likely reporting and AEC maybe is the first functionality that you use and take into production, maybe initially on a subset of the data that they do reporting on today, before they do the entire data sets and or entire reports. And then longer term, just switch over from essentially OBR into Optic Data Lake with additional AI value on top of the data. Because one advantage is already there, even in the reporting. You now have PD inside of OMI and your reporting all working on the same database. In the past, there was PD with plus Performance Engine to look at data historically into Performance Dashboard, and now is actually identical. And you see when I talk about analytics, how that solution even improves moving forward into the solutions. Now we have the clear intention to retire eventually OBR. What that timing exactly is, what is still to be looked at, but we will be the announcement ahead of time, and then inform the customers as well as you early enough before we make that public. Now, where are we from a journey perspective? Right, there are certain elements that we are working on. For example, custom metrics was not possible till 2010 IP2 or IP1. So that needed to be out. Initially, we had less nodes from a scaling perspective. So that scaling is being ramped up, as I'm trying to show here with the slope that is increasing to the full scale in the next release. In the May release, as I said, we will be documenting and release a calculator that lets you scale and calculate the sizing to the scale of 60,000 node plus. Then there's also an element of data that is relevant. We looked at the very beginning at all the third-party content when it comes to a SCOM connector, when it comes to VROps connector that was available with OBR, as well as all the management pack. That is still work that we are working on. There's a first big chunk of it coming in the May release, but then more further work needs to be done. And that's why you see also from a content perspective there a specific slope. That's why on the previous slide I said start with selected metrics, because there are specific metrics that are actually working already well, and others that is still needed to be looked at. From an events perspective, you have to have actually the events as they are enriched with CIN data from OBM moved into the Optic Data Lake. You also have additional value add from a Optic Data Lake like AEC. So it's essentially the combination that we want to look at, and that's already today available, where you have the reporting as well as the value add from an AI perspective. Now, looking a little bit closer into the content, what are we looking into? There are essentially specific metrics that are working out of today. Then there are additional metrics that we are working on. We're also working on the out-of-the-box reports for the May release, and then we're planning to extend the metrics with additional content in the May release as well. And now there's a typical two-step approach. It's more important for us to have the data into the Optic Data Lake than necessarily the out-of-the-box reports, because the reports can be generated yourself or by a PS team by just looking at the data and taking the data and creating it with BVD. Now, looking at this, there is, I think, just since last week, 2 content elements on risk, which is the Active Directory and Exchange component. There were some complications as we were developing towards that. So those 2 are on risk for the May release as it is right now. The rest is as it is on the slide. And I will mark those with a different color in a footnote before I send out the slides to Alexei. And then we basically, beyond that, for the August and May release, looking into the remaining content, whether this is Oracle Enterprise Manager from a metric perspective, where we are supporting metric or the remaining management pack. Now, you might say, well, why aren't the cloud management pack on this list? And that's what we're going to cover later when we talk about the cloud content, because that's where we're working a little bit of different strategy moving forward on how to do cloud monitoring. How do we envision migration? Now, I mentioned already, based on the question that was there in terms of roll-up, now as OBR had an ETL before it wrote the data, actually a specific aggregation before it wrote the data into the Vertica database, it essentially cannot be copied into the Optic Data Lake, because the Optic Data Lake is kept as raw data, so that we basically can utilize it at the same time for analytics. So other than NPS, who also was raw, and they are providing a data migration, we do have no intention to provide a data migration from OBR databases into the Vertica database. But we very well understand that the data that is kept in OBR quite often needs to be kept there for compliance or regulations reasons for a long time. And that's why there are actually different options in order to access this data, even after you introduce the Optic Data Lake. One is obviously to keep a copy of OBR around and access that data for whatever time or regulation that the customer needs to be compliant with in his company. The other one would be to use a BI tool to access, potentially even both. Now, you might say, but I'm not allowed from a contract perspective with a BI tool to connect to the OBR database, and that is where we have an agreement with the Vertica team. As long as we stop the data collection into OBR, we are actually allowed to connect the BI tooling to OBR, because it becomes a stale database. And in this way, the option 2 actually would actually work. So as soon as the data actually flows from the different sources into the Optic Data Lake, we can offer that option as a potential option to access the data. And then another element that we're trying to enhance BVD towards, so that with BVD today, you can only connect to a single Vertica database. And we are looking into to connect BVD to multiple databases, which is anyhow a general use case that we have heard from other customers that are interested in this. Putting this in the same Vertica cluster makes itself difficult, because this one supports a certain version of Vertica, I think 10.5 supported 9.2 and version 10 potentially. But if you're looking at like 5-6 years ahead, quickly there will be a different version that you want to have your Optic Data Lake on than necessarily the old version of the database, and will not be updating or re-evaluating whether the OBRDB would work in that new Vertica database. So that's why you see 2 Vertica clusters essentially. Okay, let's see, questions. How would the performance of report generation if customers would to generate yearly report if COSO is not having aggregation? So from a aggregation perspective, the Vertica aggregation that is doing the aggregation on read is actually performing quite well. From a yearly aggregation perspective, Sydney, that you are asking specifically, I can take that to engineering, but so far what we have been told is that the performance of the Vertica can very well deal with these ad hoc aggregation. Can we design the reporting with the respect to SLA and penalty reports using BVD? Penalty reports, I don't know. So the SLM data from APM is not yet written into COSO or into Optic Data Lake. That is still something that we need to get into. That allows us then to build some of the SLM reports that we had. If that is what it meant with SLA on penalty, Akash, I need you to be more specific. Can the COSO be standalone without having OPSB? If no, then how are we replacing OBR installed base that was a solution deployed only? Optic Data Lake can very well work without Operations Bridge from a solution perspective. So Optic Data Lake works on the NUM side entirely without Operations Bridge, on the SA side entirely without Operations Bridge. On the Operations Bridge side, we have been using the agent to ingest data, for example, from BPM. So if you have a pure APM solution and want to do the reporting, you need an agent to get the data from the BPM probes into the COSO Data Lake, and there you either use an OBM from setting the monitoring policies, or you would have to set a fixed policy directly on the agent. We're looking into whether we need to change that method now to a more direct BPM to Optic Data Lake connection, but that's something that we need to look into. At this point in time, they cannot be exported into anything else than a PDF to be generated. This is exactly what we're looking into when we're looking into from a scheduling perspective, to make sure that the right formats are there rather than maybe providing a full-on scheduler with a solution. I think it's more important to have the right formats than necessarily scheduling capabilities. But that's something that we are looking into from a post-May release priority perspective. May, Lester. Planning was May to support Vertica 10. Okay, let's see. I think I covered every COSO have aggregation. Huh? That answered the questions. Okay, now looking a little bit into AI. As I said on the events, we already do the AI capabilities, but for metrics, we had very little AI in the overall tooling. There is a baselining that the NUM team put inside the technology stack, but there was relatively little outside of that. So what we're doing in the May timeframe is basically taking Operations Bridge analytics and make it work on top of the Optic metrics as they are without any change. That gives you all the capabilities that are there from an Operations Bridge analytics perspective on top of the metrics inside of the Optic Data Lake without ingesting them again or without copying them around into another table. So as the data is inside of Optic, it can be directly accessed. Now, those are the two areas on centralized adaptive alerting, which is essentially the anomaly detection that automatically generates an alert if something goes wrong in your environment. And the other area is from a metric perspective, the root cause analysis, where it basically analyzes log and metrics to basically drive root cause analysis and forensics. From a log perspective, we will be using the OBA data ingestion into the Optic data lake, and the logs will be ending up in the OBA data structures and not in the Optic data structures, but it will be a single vertical cluster. Talk about that in a little bit more second. The rest of it here is shipping from an AI capabilities. We have the event correlation there, which we'll be talking about in a second. And then the other two items are actually elements that are inside the agent itself, where we basically can do some of the capabilities at source, which is equally important to basically explain customers on what is our core value when it comes to the data collection, like the agent itself, from a value perspective. Very important also is the element of being an open platform, so that you actually, with the documentation of the schema, we also actually provide access to the SQL functions, 600 plus machine learning functions to the SQL that allows you to essentially do your own machine learning on top of the data from a tooling perspective. Okay, so let's first talk about the AEC. Hopefully something that you are already very familiar with on how we are positioning and how we are leveraging it. We're basically having as a complementary solution to the other capabilities that we, complementary solution to the other capabilities that we have inside of the operations bridge to actually drive the event correlation automatically. Now, the AI solution is basically picking automatically a message out of the group that basically would be used as the top message to be handling this group, and the algorithm today that picks this message is essentially the highest severity in the group. Now, not necessarily always the highest severity is the root cause, and that is where the other technologies, the rule-based, are actually more deterministic, because you can configure, change the entire group as you wish, and you can select exactly the root cause message that you want to have to be displayed for the group. You can exclude certain events, include certain events. On the AEC base, you essentially have the ability to promote or prohibit a certain grouping behavior, but you don't have the controls like the ruling. That's why I carefully say it's a complementary solution, or a complementary solution, because of those value sets. We're going to further enhance automatic event correlation to come more to a probable root cause solution, as well as give you more controls on controlling what AEC does, but that is something that we are still working on. From a capability perspective, it does use topology like TBAC, but it's not depending on it. Now, why is that important? Because topology is always something that gives the data additional context. And we're looking at two competitors like Moogsoft and others. They are all trying to get a way to get topology into their product in order to derive additional insight from the data from it in order to make it work. We have it naturally in the product, built in inherently into the end-to-end product. And also our solutions, we have basically automatically discovering application topology with our management pack. And we have changed the network integration to collect the network topology through UD into the RTSM. Very importantly, if you use the out-of-the-box NMI integration, that directly puts the data from network topology into RTSM, you do not have the connection between the system and the layer 2 connectivity into the network. You would need the UD integration, universal discovery, that comes with the ultimate package in order to collect that network data, because then we can stitch together the system connectivity into the network, which is a key element. Combining that with an enrichment rule that we post on the marketplace allows you to get the impact relationship between the network and the system, which then allows you to basically gain the value from our automatic correlation perspective that we anticipate. We have showcased that from a scenario perspective, has it available on demo system, and have extended that solution at the universe with a Dynatrace operations bridge combination, where we basically, in addition to the topology that you see here, have put in the automatically uploaded Dynatrace topology that we are collecting from the Dynatrace application into operations bridge through the integration hub, overlaid and shown in the demo on Arun's environment, Arun Sharma, that is, how that actually correlates automatically together. And then, as I said, the options that you have in order to train this algorithm is actually the promote and prohibit capabilities here in the custom actions. Now, TBAC versus AEC, I think I talked already about it in terms of identifying the fixed root cause per rule. At the bottom is clearly the advantage of the rule-based solution. Now, the other element also is TBAC is dependent on topology. Without it isn't working. It is dependent on ETIs. Without it's not working. AEC takes advantage of those same attributes if they are there, but if not, it still works because it can take custom attributes, kit severity, user-defined attributes, all of those elements it can actually take in order to make its own correlation rules and understand how the data belongs together. So it does not have the mandatory dependencies on ETIs and topology such as TBAC. On the downside then here, as I said, it does not identify the root cause. It just groups the messages together that it thinks belong together. Where are we taking it next? The next one we're looking into as we realize working through that the applications data, the object, the severity combo provide actually very little capability sometimes in order to do quick, good correlation stuff. We're starting to generate automatically a cluster ID. See it similar to a automatic generated ETI, that we're basically taking the group of events, grouping them together, and if they are having the same context, we're giving them the same cluster ID. And then AEC would use that cluster ID from a correlation perspective. So basically, kind of think about it, creates its own ETI information as we're getting the data into the information. That actually removes some of the dependency on the custom attributes, which, as we said, were less insightful, and actually allows us to much better work on top of the data, where it neither had ETI or ETI hints in the third-party data that we were looking at. This is something that we're planning from a May release perspective. We are right now in the testing to understand how the capability of that automatic event typing is improving the efficiency of the AEC algorithm. So I can't exactly give you as now a 2x, 3x improvement over finding correlation groups on top of third-party data. That is still testing that has to happen. Okay, before I go into that, let's see whether there's any elements or questions on AEC. When do we see log correlation, which can help customers to better analyze root cause as log analytics? Okay, we come to that, Priyanka, when we're talking about OBA. So I'll pause that question. Okay, so I talked about we will be introducing or reintroducing Operations Bridge Analytics, but not with its own data collection and not with its own vertical database. We basically will be using the Optic data lake to directly use it, and that's what we will do with the Operations Bridge Analytics 2021-05. So you will install OBA in its classic form as you do know it today, and you will point it to an optic data lake, and it will start using the data inside the optic data lake for its magic from a correlation perspective. It will allow to give you analytical insight such as anomaly detection, metric correlation, hotspots, etc. From a log perspective, which was Priyanka's question a second ago, we will be using the OBA capability. We'll be using the data path as it gets into the Vertica database, as well as offer the same log capabilities that we had before on the OBA. So all the log analytics in terms of identifying which messages are relevant are actually part of that solution. Now, as we move forward, we are looking into to provide more out-of-the-box rule-based analytical use cases is something that we're looking for, same as on AEC, where in addition to the network use case, we added in the Dynatrace use case. We are more looking into our analytical offers to make them more use case driven and more solution driven, so that we can actually provide those as a solution, as well as making sure that the products link closer together and do not appear as two independent products. So, for example, the anomaly detection screen, merge that into the overall OBM main screen, so that you basically click on an anomaly event and immediately can see that anomaly investigation pane in the OBM My Workspace. Okay, let's dive into this a little bit more detail. There's a real world scenario from a large car manufacturer in the US that was trying to understand, okay, if I look at my CPU metrics, I really would like to be alerted only if a specific baseline breach happens very often in a specific time period. If it occasionally happens, like in this green area, I'd like that to be ignored, but I'd like it to be alarmed if something happens very frequently after each other. And that's exactly where anomaly detection can help, because the occasionally spikes, it will not trigger off from an alerting perspective. Only if you have multiple spikes outside of a baseline, it will actually trigger a event into the overall event flow. And that's a specific use case scenario we discussed with a large car manufacturer in the US. Now, how do we do that? It's essentially the adaptive alerting, as we're trying to name it, in the anomaly detection, where you basically have the ability that OBA looks on top of the different metrics, identifies baselines, calculates seasonality, and then if there are multiple breaches of that baseline on metrics that belong together, it would basically generate an alert inside the OBM event stream, and that alert then is directly linked to such a page. And this is exactly the screen that we're trying to see to get into OBM My Workspace, so that when you click on it, you actually understand the data. Now, the advantage of it is particularly if you're looking into cloud data, into the optic data lake, is to use the system itself to actually alert you on the metrics that it sees, rather than necessarily providing threshold policies for every single metric that you're trying to collect, because specifically in serverless applications, there are a huge amount of metrics that we are looking into and trying to collect. Okay, the other element is actually providing the other metrics capabilities, whether these are forecasting or metric correlation, understanding which metrics belong together, or use the same seasonality understanding to forecast a metric into the future, to essentially allow us understanding how a metric will behave moving into the future. Those are more for the root cause analysis. So for a subject matter expert sitting in front of the screen, in order to understand what's happening with the metrics, what potentially could be the root cause, or the needle in the haystack, and really tailored toward the subject matter expert sitting in front of the screen and using it rather than necessarily an operator looking at the event. Now, log analytics will also be there, as I said, as part of it. So you still have the same capability. You have the search, everything that you know of from OBA. It will be there available. The only difference is here it's in the OBA data schemas, not in the optic data schemas, and we are very likely to rework the log ingestion moving forward. When and how is yet to be seen. Right now, we're taking the log ingestion as it is with the connections that we have to Splunk, Logstash, etc. All the log connections that you know from an OBA perspective. Now, how does it change from a deployment perspective? You essentially have an OBA server that you installed, and today with 3.5, it has its own data collections for metrics and for logs, and it would store it in its own Vertica database. And then from a reporting perspective, if you had Optic Data Lake, you would actually put the data in addition as an additional copy for metrics into the Optic Data Lake. So moving forward with 2021-05, we are using a single Vertica cluster. We're using the optic metric ingestion, directly streaming of metrics into the optic data lake in order to take advantage of optic. Only logs goes through its own data path from a OBA collector perspective. The functions will be provided through an OBA app server. So we basically will be providing a OBA server installed standalone outside of the Kubernetes cluster in order to take advantage of the OBA functions from an analytical function perspective as well as from a visualization function perspective, and then take advantage of the data as it is. This is a screen that is still a little bit in direction. Now, the advantage that you have already is a top part, which means same as with the reporting perspective, SPD can display the same data performance dashboard or performance perspective in OBM can display the same data in Optic Data Lake that now OBA would work on. The operator can actually click on the anomaly message and look at the metrics of that anomaly message as part of a performance dashboard because it's all the same data. But what we're trying to do is getting the bottom screen as a stretch goal into the My Workspace. May release, if not May, it will happen in the follow-on release so that we basically unify the overall user experience from that perspective, so that an operator immediately can see why am I getting this anomaly message? Is that something that we need to worry about? Yes or no? Okay. Okay, John Paul. This would at least lessen server footprint, doesn't it? Yes. So when you're looking into, I think this question from John Paulo was regarding this element here today. When you're looking at this solution specifically on the Vertica side, if those Vertica clusters are all high available, you would be looking in the current solution at 6 Vertica nodes, while in the future, in the 2105 time frame, you would looking at 3 Vertica nodes, and that the log data is in a different schema than the metric data from a footprint perspective makes absolutely no difference. The only thing that you need in addition is the OBA app server, which eventually will move into a Kubernetes function as we move it over. When that will happen is something that we need to look into, but eventually that will also run in the same cluster as all the other Kubernetes functions. And then the other thing that lessens footprint is something on BYOK that we talk about in a second. Can Optic collect logs from ELK? So we do support, and I need to look into that. We do support Logstash as a direct data feed into the OBA, whether how we would collect it from a centralized Elasticsearch already data consolidated log information is something that I need to investigate. I got that question the other day. I don't have the answer yet. Okay. Customer adoption of Optic Data Lake. Where are we with customers adopting the solution? And there I really want to point you to a good session from a universe perspective that shows you how far we can be with a customer. Now, Kasib presented at the universe in International. So Julien was talking about his environment. He was talking about monitoring as a code, which we extended with him as we worked through this through the use of the COSO data lake, as well as a concept that we call dashboard as a code, where we essentially using performance troubleshooter and letting the developers that actually define what they want to have monitored to define at the time for the metrics that are not there from an out-of-the-box visualization perspective to define exactly on how they want specific metrics to be displayed. That is something where you see that the suites are using the technology across the board. It's possible today with the operations bridge to take advantage of performance troubleshooter. We have not documented or shipping it, so it's a working with a reference customer on an advanced technology. But that is something that we will document as we move forward. But the interesting piece is he has connected 12,000 agents that he actually collects. Everything that is green here on this slide, he basically has completed. So he's essentially connected 12,000 agents into the Optic Data Lake, where he's collecting the metrics and getting them into the data lake. He does agent metric collection rather than necessarily streaming of the metrics. He has the OMI events and topology moved into the Optic Data Lake. He has experimented with Power BI, but has not completed the Power BI report that he wanted to do, and is using primarily the operations bridge tooling to visualize the data out of the box reports with BVD, as well as PD in order to look at the data. Next, what he's planning to do is connecting his NNMI instances. And we also have done a few third-party metric connections with a toolkit that we just released already here at this environment. Now, looking into the overall, beyond that, just Crédit Agricole, we have essentially 3 customers in production with 2020-08, 5 customers very close to production, where one of them are expecting to go this or next week into production, with a combination of the one that I'm talking about is primarily on top of third-party data when it comes to event and metrics. And then additional 20 customers validating actively Optic Data Lake and reporting with regard to AC. So a lot of customers are looking, having it already in their lab, trying to see, okay, how can I take it into production? And as I said, a couple of them close to take it into production as the next element. When you're looking from a use case perspective, what you see here, where we have a agent and or system and network use case combined, is actually common at 30% of those customers evaluating the environment. And in addition to Crédit Agricole, we are also in Europe Cosmodi, presented by Performance, who is a partner using and deploying the solution and being one of the customers on the top there from a closed production, but not the one on top of third party that I was talking about. So quite an uptake from a solution perspective. And here's what I'm talking about. Crédit Agricole is very well in a supported environment, even with 2020-10, if you're looking at 12,000 agents, because it's well below the 18,000 elements that we have certified from a connection perspective. Okay, so with that, let's get into cloud monitoring. Where are we taking it from a cloud monitoring, and why didn't we see any AWS or Azure management pack on the content roadmap? And the reason for that is that we're basically looking into the cloud monitoring, and we looked into the management packs and realized if customers want to have a full cloud native environment and monitor those environments, we are starting to run into scale limits. The agent has a limitation in terms of number of elements that it can discover from the agent management pack perspective. When it then comes to high scale metric ingestion, as I said earlier, it has a agent metric store, which is designed primarily for a single a system metric store, could be used for limited amount of metrics to be routed through. But when it comes high scale cloud native metrics that it wants to, and specifically for serverless application that you want to route through, we're reaching its limits. So that's why we're looking into a collection directly from within the Kubernetes cluster that allows us to easily dynamically scale out the collection itself and open up a direct pipe into the Optic Data Lake. We will be in May releasing a beta for AWS, which in addition to the standard topology collects tags that allows us to then use that text from a topology browsing through the data so that we actually can take advantage of it. In addition, as those metrics cannot be handled necessarily with the classical threshold that we would use normally in the agent, we can then use technologies like the baselining, like the adaptive alerting on top of the Optic Data Lake in order to manage those cloud environments. After the beta, we basically plan to enhance it further quickly into other technologies, as well as releasing it, Azure and Google Cloud being the next, and then also as a third element moving into a native Kubernetes monitoring solution. In addition, supporting additional concept from a deployment perspective, for example, deploying the entire stack together, for example, with a Terraform solution. We had COSO, Kevin Hoffman, at the Micro Focus Universe Americas presenting how he is doing it already today, documenting those centrally through white papers, practitioner notes is something that we plan to move as we move forward. So AWS collection in beta in May, and then released likely in a quarter later, depending on the feedback that we're getting on the beta. Now, looking into what is part of that capability in the beta, we basically have initially we have specific services that we're covering, like ASG, ELB, EBS, S3, etc. The important is that we can easily scale beyond 10,000 plus, which was the limit of the agent resources, with multiple collector instances that we could actually scale within the cluster. We're extending the collection in addition to the tagging, which when you're looking into the cloud native solution is something that is important for people who deploy cloud native applications. And then starting to use the capabilities from the NOM team from a baselining perspective on top of metrics that are getting into the Optic Data Lake. Further on, we then plan to add in UI installs through the App Hub. Initially, it will be a CLI install, a Helm install. Generally, the O5 suite on containers will all be driven through the new App Hub UI install, like the other suites as well. But the specific function will not integrate yet in the beta in the App Hub UI. And then we'll be also extending services as we move forward and integrate other features such as the additional defaults and thresholds from a metrics perspective. Okay, and then moving forward, it's essentially an extension of services that we're planning to do. So that we basically are extending beyond the services that you saw at the beginning. Already in the August release, we plan to further enhance, depending a little bit on what is the team busy with. When we have a list of beta customers that we work with, are they working primarily on beta feedback, or can we have time to, as we plan to extend further the services? We will also plan to integrate the log solution from CloudWatch, so that we can get actually CloudWatch logs moved into the Optic Data Lake, and that is then taking advantage of those CloudWatch logs with things like the OBA functions, using more tags inside of the UIs from the Operations Bridge Manager today. From an eventing perspective, for example, to be able to filter on those events, so make tags a more, I would say, full-blown citizen as part of the overall solution, and then basically enhancing it from a future perspective, solution perspective, go into Google, go into Azure, go into native container monitoring, etc. Okay, so that is from a question perspective. One thing that I missed that I didn't have on the slide was the overall bring your own Kubernetes deployment as part of the cloud of the May release. We are supporting Optic Data Lake to be deployed in AWS and Azure. Bring your own Kubernetes. We do integrate into the App Hub integration, so that allows us to basically give you, in addition to the Helm install of the suite, which is a CLI-based install, a UI-based install. But just realized that I was talking about it, but I didn't have a dedicated slide on it. Okay, any closing questions? Multi-tenancy. Good, Dinesh, good question. Yes, multi-tenancy is part of the May release, where we're supporting multi-tenancy for the data. The data ingestion is already adding as much as aware of a tenant ID to the data that is being ingested, and the May release will then take advantage of it from an Optic Data Lake perspective. I hear some background noise. I don't know whether everybody's hearing that. Okay. Other questions? Okay. If not, Alexa, I guess that means we are through the session today.
Okay. Thank you very much, Harald. It's Alon. Okay, if there are no questions, let me stop the recording.